For a little bit more on the subject, we're joined from our Cape Town studios by Stanley Henkeman, who heads the Building an Inclusive Society program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. A very good morning to you, Mr. Henkeman, and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Valen. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Has there been an increase, or is it just an increase in the reporting on such incidences of mob justice? And is it truly that?
Valen, it's a very complex question because certainly as soon as something hits the newspapers and the news headlines, we all take notice of it. But mob justice is not a new phenomenon. It has been around in South Africa. In fact, it's a universal phenomenon. And one has to really look at why mob justice happens, because it's not something that happens in isolation. If you speak to the people who we regard as the perpetrators, they would tell you that they have very good reasons for doing what they're doing. And so it is important to contextualize every aspect of mob justice and not just write it off as people doing something indiscriminately. So there is an outside story, and that's what we see on the television screens, in the newspapers. But I think there's also an inside story, and the inside story is really about trying to understand why this happens and why people feel a need to take the law into their own hands, because that's essentially what mob justice is.
But is there ever a point in society where we can justify taking somebody else's life for perhaps taking a lawnmower or a cell phone? The two things just are so unequitable. And in a country where we don't even have the death penalty, you know, these are not forms of recourse that we as a society say that we accept.
Valen, you're absolutely right. There is no way that anyone can justify the killing of another person for whatever reason. And so the first thing that one has to do is to condemn it and to say that it cannot be tolerated, it should not be tolerated in a society that wants to be a society that looks after all its people. That's the first thing. The second thing is that for me, the problem is that when you have mob justice, there seems to be, for me, a breakdown in the concept of the rule of law. For some reason, people who participate in mob justice or even who perpetrate these acts have a sense that the law is not doing what they think it should be doing. And so it really is a crisis of trust in institutions that are supposed to uphold the law. Now, of course, one has to take into account that the way we see the world is not necessarily the way the world is, but it is the way we are. And so so people look at what's happening in their communities from their own perspective. And when there's a sense that the law is not doing what it's supposed to do, then of course you have issues of people feeling that there's no justice, and so they need to take the law into their own hands. And so the first thing that I think we need to understand is that the authorities that needs to protect people and make sure that perpetrators of all kinds of ills in our society are brought to book, and that justice is seen to be done. And often people in communities where mob justice happens have that sense that justice is not being done. And so, yes, condemn it roundly, and there's no way one can ever justify it. But at the same time, one has to get to a point where for people who are marginalized, who feel under siege, because if you look at where this happens, it happens in communities that find themselves under siege. And it's in communities where crime is rampant, crime is out of hand, and they often see perpetrators walking the streets the very next day after they've been arrested. And so it's a combination of people taking the law into their own hands, but also the law not being seen to be on the side of those who are law-abiding citizens.
how much of a factor is that little part that maybe there are certain communities in South Africa and large communities in South Africa that have an unresolved past, that aren't healed from the past, that also may contribute to this, rather than just saying that it's their current circumstances only that are bringing this out? I mean, what else would you say is going on there that may factor into this outcome of mob justice being seen as the way to deal with situations?
Valen, there is no doubt that, even 21 years after democracy, we're still a very deeply wounded society. And sadly, we don't talk enough about this, and we don't bring it to the surface enough in order to deal with it. If you just think back to the days of apartheid, people didn't, and I'm talking about black people generally, didn't really respect the authorities, because there was a sense that the authorities were not there for the welfare of black people. And so, so the issue of the rule of law was not a big issue. And I'm just wondering whether we did enough in the transition period and in the first years of democracy to help people understand that we have made a transition. Now, admittedly, as far as the police is concerned, there was an attempt to move from a police force to a police service. But Valen, I think the one thing that is important to state here is that just because we articulate certain things doesn't mean that it is going to happen. And sadly, while we talk about the police service, many people in our country still experience the police as a force, and a force that really does not always serve the interests of all the people. There are so many reports of a breakdown in trust between police and communities, between the justice system and people in communities. And the more people feel themselves marginalized, the more they feel that they have to fend for themselves. And so this marginalization is something that comes from a previous era, and you're absolutely right when you say that it is something that we're still carrying from the past, and we're not doing enough to deal with it. And one of the ways to deal with it is to openly talk about the damage that apartheid has done to the psyche of people and the way people see each other. Yeah. In essence, that system was a system that created hierarchies between people. Some people were regarded as superhuman or better than human, and of course the majority were regarded as subhuman. And if you are told, and if your life is dominated by the sense that you are less than, people will start acting out in that way. And so it's something that I think we really have not interrogated enough. We haven't dealt with the trauma in a way that we can say our nation is healing. We're doing well on the surface, and that's why I spoke about the outside story and the inside story. In the eyes of the world, we're doing well. And compared to the rest of the world economically, the rest of Africa, we're doing okay. But the inside story is that we are a nation that is still deeply wounded from the past. And unless we tackle that, we will see these occurrences all the time. It doesn't matter what it is. In this
Stanley,
case, it's mob justice. It could be xenophobia.
Because unfortunately we've run out of time, but it's certainly a very important point to make, and certainly something that does factor into so many parts of the way that we see that South Africa and South Africans deal with situations. That was Stanley Henkeman, who heads the Building an Inclusive Society program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Thank you very much for your time from our Cape Town studios.